The stagecoach wheezed to a stop in a cloud of alkali dust, and Maggie Crawford stepped down into her new captivity. Copper Creek stretched before her, one muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings that leaned against the Wyoming wind. She clutched her carpetbag, though it held nothing but ghosts. Marshall Hutchins unfolded her papers with thick fingers, avoiding her eyes. "Riverside Inn, Mrs. Talbot's expecting you." The words fell like stones between them. Auction girl, property, sold. The saloon's windows glowed amber against December's early darkness. Warmth and laughter spilling onto the street where she stood. Inside, families gathered for Christmas Eve. Outside, she remained what the papers declared a purchased thing. Her fingers found the brass tag hidden in her coat lining. Number 47. Once she'd had a name that mattered. Now she had only empty hands and a debt that would never be paid. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The kitchen heat pressed against Maggie's back as she moved between tables, her stomach clenched tight as a fist. 3 days since her arrival, 3 days of serving food she couldn't touch. Mrs. Talbot had made the rules clear. Auction girls ate only what paying customers left behind, and respectable folks in Copper Creek cleaned their plates. The saloon door swung open, bringing a gust of winter air that set the coal oil lamps flickering. Samuel Carter stood in the doorway, snow dusting the shoulders of his worn trail coat. The room shifted, conversations dropping to murmurs. Men nodded, women straightened their skirts. Carter commanded respect without asking for it, a rancher who'd carved his fortune from hostile land and held it through sheer will. He took his usual corner table, back to the wall, facing the door. Maggie approached with the coffee pot, her hands steady despite the trembling in her belly. She'd learned to hide hunger the way she'd learned to hide everything else. "Evening, Mr. Carter." "The special's beef stew." His eyes lifted to hers, gray as winter sage, holding neither pity nor cruelty. Just observation. "That'll do." She poured his coffee, noting the calluses on his hands, the silver threading through dark hair that needed cutting. A widower, the kitchen gossip said. 2 years since consumption took his Mary. The Triple C Ranch prospered, but the man who owned it ate most dinners alone. The stew came up hot from the kitchen, thick with potatoes and carrots, the beef tender enough to cut with a spoon. She set it before him, the aroma making her mouth water. He lifted his spoon, then paused, watching her reflection in the window glass. She stood frozen, seeing what he saw, a girl pretending she wasn't starving, maintaining dignity like armor. Around them, families discussed the evening's church social. Children begged for peppermint sticks. Wives planned Christmas morning surprises. The abundance of their joy pressed against Maggie's isolation, marking her as separate, other, less than. "You not attending the social?" Carter's question surprised her. "Working, sir." He nodded, returning to his meal, but his eyes tracked her movement across the room, noting how she gripped the back of a chair when dizziness struck, how she pressed a hand to her stomach when she thought no one was looking. The church bells began their bronze calling, and the saloon slowly emptied. Carter remained, his stew barely touched, still watching her reflection in the darkening glass. The last family departed for church, mother herding children like chickens, father fumbling with his pocket watch. The saloon doors swung shut behind them, leaving Maggie alone with dirty tables and the lingering warmth of the pot-belly stove. Through the frosted windows, she watched lanterns bobbing down Main Street toward the white steeple, carrying Christmas Eve worshippers to their prayers and fellowship. She moved mechanically, gathering plates still warm with gravy, cups stained with coffee rings. The blue willow pattern on Mrs. Talbot's good china blurred through her exhaustion. 5 days now without a proper meal. The hollow ache in her belly had transformed into something sharper, a gnawing creature that clouded her thoughts and made her hands shake as she stacked dishes. The water in the wash basin had gone tepid, but she added more lye soap and plunged her hands into the suds. The harsh soap stung the cracks in her fingers, small wounds from endless washing. She scrubbed each plate with focused attention, as if cleanliness could somehow earn her worth, prove she was more than the papers that declared her purchased property. The door opened again. She didn't turn, expecting Mrs. Talbot returning for her forgotten prayer book or Marshall Hutchins checking locks. But the footsteps were different measured, deliberate, spurs singing a quiet metallic song against the floorboards. Samuel Carter stood at his corner table, still wearing his trail coat, holding his barely touched bowl of stew. The beef had congealed slightly, a film of fat forming on the surface, but steam still rose when he stirred it with his spoon. He set the bowl on the clean table she'd just wiped, then reached into his coat pocket. Maggie watched, confused, as he produced a bone-handled pocket knife, its blade worn thin from years of use. He'd left his bread untouched too, a thick heel of sourdough that Mrs. Talbot baked fresh each morning. Carter unfolded the knife with practiced ease, the blade catching lamplight as he drew it through the bread's crust. The sound was intimate in the empty saloon, a domestic gesture that belonged to kitchens and family tables, not this space between stranger and servant. He cut the bread precisely in half, measuring with his eye, making the portions equal. Then he divided the stew itself, spooning exactly half onto the plate's far edge, leaving meat, potatoes, and gravy in careful proportion. The carrots glistened with butter. The beef fell apart at the spoon's touch, tender as anything Maggie remembered from the life before, when she'd had a name that wasn't preceded by auction. Carter looked up then, meeting her eyes directly, no pity in his gaze, no charity, something else recognition, perhaps, one person seeing another clearly. He pushed the plate across the table with 2 fingers, a slow, deliberate slide across the worn wood. The gesture was neither kind nor unkind. It simply was. "Kitchens close Sundays," he said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "You'll need breakfast." Maggie's pride rose like bile in her throat. She'd sworn never to beg, never to take charity, to maintain what little dignity remained after being sold like livestock. But her body betrayed her. Her stomach clenched audibly, a sound that echoed in the quiet room. Her knees weakened. 5 days of hunger crashed over her like a physical weight. She moved toward the table as if in a dream. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the same spoon she'd set out for him an hour ago. The first bite of beef nearly undid her. The richness, the salt, the substance of it flooding her mouth. She ate slowly, carefully, aware of him sitting across from her, working through his own portion with steady concentration. Neither spoke. The only sounds were spoons against china, the soft tear of bread, the distant hymn singing drifting from the church. Silent night in wavering voices. The German words Mrs. Muller insisted on teaching the congregation. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The food warmed her from within, each bite restoring something she'd thought lost. Not just physical sustenance, but something deeper, the simple humanity of sharing a meal. Carter never looked at her directly, keeping his attention on his own plate, allowing her the privacy of her hunger. When she paused, overwhelmed, he pushed the salt toward her without comment. When her water glass sat empty, he filled it from the pitcher, still without meeting her eyes. They finished simultaneously, as if choreographed. Carter wiped his mouth with his handkerchief, folded it precisely, returned it to his pocket. Then he stood, reaching into his vest. The coins he laid on the table were more than the meal cost, significantly more. Among the smaller coins sat a silver dollar, its eagle bright in the lamplight. "For the extra service," he said, though she'd done nothing beyond serving his original meal. "Keeping the place open late." He turned toward the door, then paused. "The Reverend gives a long sermon. You've got time to finish the washing." The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Maggie sat alone, staring at the silver dollar. Her first money is something other than property. She pressed it between her palms, feeling its solid weight, its promise. Then she returned to the wash basin. where her tears fell silently into the lye soap suds, invisible evidence of a gratitude too large for words. Outside, the hymn singing continued, joy and redemption in major keys. Inside, Maggie dried the blue willow plates with newfound care, understanding that salvation sometimes came not from heaven, but from the simple gesture of a plate pushed across a table, a meal shared between two people who understood what it meant to be alone. Sunday morning arrived wrapped in frost, the December air sharp enough to cut. Maggie woke before dawn in her narrow room behind the kitchen, the silver dollar hidden beneath her straw mattress like a talisman. The saloon lay silent. Sunday was the Lord's Day, and even Mrs. Talbot wouldn't dare open for business until after evening service. She dressed in the dark, her fingers stiff with cold as she buttoned the calico work dress Mrs. Talbot had grudgingly provided. It was faded blue, mended at the elbows, but clean. The first dress in months that didn't mark her as property for sale. She wrapped her shawl tight and crept toward the kitchen's back door, planning to fetch water before the town stirred. The door stuck as always, requiring her shoulder to push it open, but when it swung wide, she nearly stumbled over something placed directly on the threshold. A willow basket sat waiting, covered with a clean flour sack towel. Maggie glanced around the empty alley, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Nothing moved except a tabby cat prowling for mice near the grain storage. She knelt beside the basket, lifting the towel's corner cautiously, as if it might contain something dangerous. Eggs nestled in straw, still warm. 4 brown eggs so fresh they seemed to hold the heat of the hens that laid them. Beside them, wrapped in another cloth, sat 2 biscuits large as her palm, their tops golden and split naturally where they'd risen. A small crock of strawberry jam caught the early light like garnets. At the basket's bottom, a mason jar of milk so rich the cream had separated to the top. No note, no identification, but Maggie knew. She carried the basket inside with the reverence reserved for church relics, setting it on the scarred wooden table, where she took her meager meals when Mrs. Talbot permitted. The kitchen stove still held yesterday's banked coals. She fed it kindling, coaxing flame back to life, needing the warmth but also needing something to do with her hands while her mind raced. Who was Samuel Carter? This taciturn rancher who shared his supper and left breakfast like a secret. She'd known men who wanted things from auction girls. Their papers gave certain rights that made her stomach turn to consider. But Carter asked for nothing. He barely spoke. He simply provided. She scrambled 2 eggs in the spider skillet, adding a precious pinch of salt from the box. The biscuits she warmed on the stovetop, watching them carefully to prevent burning. When she finally sat to eat, the simple meal felt like a feast. The jam was sweet with summer, tasting of sunshine and ordinary happiness. The milk coated her throat, rich and wholesome. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, storing the memory against future hunger. Through the kitchen window, she spotted movement at the livery stable across the alley. A familiar horse, a bay gelding with a white blaze down its nose. Carter's horse. She recognized from last night when he'd ridden away from the saloon. The horse stood saddled and ready, steam rising from its nostrils, but Carter himself remained hidden in the stable's shadows. Was he watching, waiting to see if she'd found his gift? The realization should have frightened her, a man lurking, observing, but instead, she felt something else. Protected, perhaps, seen. Not as property or potential pleasure, but as a person who needed breakfast on a cold Sunday morning. She finished eating, washed her dishes carefully, then made a decision. The water barrels needed filling anyway. Mrs. Talbot would expect them full before evening service ended. She took the wooden yoke and both buckets, stepping out into the bright winter morning. The well stood in the town square, a communal gathering spot marked by worn earth and gossip. On Sundays it was usually deserted until after church, but as Maggie approached, she saw a figure already there, drawing water with practiced efficiency. Carter looked up as she approached, touching his hat brim in greeting. He wore different clothes than his usual trail outfit, a clean flannel shirt the color of rust, canvas pants without holes. His Sunday clothes, she realized. though he wouldn't be attending church any more than she would. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning." She set down her buckets, aware of the basket's weight in her recent meal, wondering if she should acknowledge it. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but waiting. "Water's sweeter from the north side," he said finally, gesturing to where he stood. "South side pulls from near the livestock pens. North pulls from the upstream aquifer." Practical information, nothing more. But he stepped aside, making room for her at the better position. She moved to the spot he'd indicated, aware of his nearness, the soap and leather scent of him mixing with the cold air. Her hands shook slightly as she lowered the well's common bucket on its hemp rope. "You're settling in, then?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. Thank you for asking. Just Carter, or Samuel, if you prefer. The sir makes me look for my father, and he's been gone 15 years. She pulled up the full bucket, pouring it into her own containers. The water was indeed sweeter from this side, cleaner tasting. "How did you know about the water?" "Been here 12 years. Man learns things." He paused, then added, "Ranch has 3 wells. Had to dig them myself. You learn to taste the difference between good water and bad. You built the Triple C yourself." "Mostly. Had help from Mary." His voice caught slightly on the name. "My wife. She had opinions about where things should go. Usually right, too." Maggie continued drawing water, letting the silence resettle around his grief. She understood the weight of absent names, the people who shadowed daily life through their absence. When her buckets were full, she fitted them to the yoke, preparing to lift the heavy load. "That's too much weight," Carter observed. "Make 2 trips. No sense straining yourself." Mrs. Talbot expects a lot of things. Doesn't mean she's entitled to all of them." His tone carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "You're no good to anyone injured." She set down one bucket, acknowledging the wisdom. As she adjusted the yoke for a single bucket, he spoke again. "Every Sunday. The basket. Same place." The words came quick, as if he needed to say them before losing nerve. "Kitchen's closed. Like I said, person needs breakfast. I can't accept charity." "Not charity." He cut her off, but gently. "It's practical. You work hard, need food to work. Simple economics." Before she could respond, he touched his hat again and strode away toward the livery stable. She watched him go, noting the slight favor of his left leg, an old injury that showed only when he was tired. He collected his horse and rode out toward the Triple C, not looking back. Maggie carried her water to the inn, thinking about simple economics and sweet water and the way he'd said his wife's name. When she returned for the second bucket, she found it already filled and waiting, though Carter was nowhere in sight. But there on the well's stone rim sat a small thing, a peppermint stick wrapped in paper. The kind children begged for at the mercantile. She picked it up, turning it in her fingers. This frivolous, sweet thing that served no practical purpose at all. Through the inn's window, she saw Mrs. Talbot watching with suspicious eyes. Let her wonder, Maggie thought with sudden defiance. Some mysteries deserved protecting. That evening, after Mrs. Talbot returned from church full of gossip and righteousness, she cornered Maggie in the kitchen. "I hear you were conversing with Samuel Carter at the well. He mentioned the water's sweeter from the north side." Mrs. Talbot's eyes narrowed. "That man's got no cause to be talking to you. His wife's barely cold. And you with your papers and situation. I won't have scandal attached to my establishment." "There's no scandal in discussing well water. Don't get above yourself, girl. You're here on my sufferance. Your papers make you mine until the debt's paid. And that won't be for years yet. You remember your place." Maggie lowered her eyes, playing the submissive role. But her hand found the peppermint stick in her pocket, its ridges pressing against her palm like a promise. Sunday became the axis around which her week turned. Each Sabbath morning brought the basket, though the contents varied, sometimes corn cakes instead of biscuits, once a precious orange that must have cost dear at the mercantile, always the eggs, always the milk, always no note. Though she began to recognize the careful way he folded the towel, military corners that spoke of habit and order, and each Sunday at the well, they exchanged careful words, the weather, the water levels, the price of grain, never anything personal, never anything that could fuel gossip, but slowly, through these mundane exchanges, she began to know him, the way he checked the sky for weather signs, his knowledge of the land's hidden springs, the careful way he spoke of neighbors, never unkind but always honest. 5 Sundays passed this way, 5 baskets, 5 conversations by the well, and on the 5th Sunday, as snow began to fall in thick, lazy flakes, he said something different. Ranch needs help with preserving. Garden came in strong this year, more than Maria can handle alone. Maria, his housekeeper. Maggie had heard of her in town gossip, an older Mexican woman who'd worked for the Carters since they'd arrived. Thursdays, he continued, not quite looking at her. Your half-day off. Isn't it pay would be fair? $1 a day, plus what you preserve for yourself. $1 a day. More than she made in a week at the inn. And food she could keep. It was too generous. Suspiciously so. But looking at his face, she saw only that same practical consideration. Simple economics, as he'd said. I'd need Mrs. Talbot's permission. Already spoke to her, told her it was business, ranch business. She agreed. Of course she had. No one refused Samuel Carter when he spoke of business. His success had built half the town's prosperity through contracts and cattle sales. Then yes, Maggie said. I accept. He nodded once. Business concluded. But as he turned to go, he paused. The water really is sweeter from the north side. That wasn't just talk. She smiled then, the first real smile since her arrival in Copper Creek. I know. That Thursday, when she climbed aboard his wagon for the ride to the Triple C, she carried the silver dollar in her pocket alongside the peppermint stick she still hadn't eaten, talismans both, protecting her against a future that was finally, carefully, beginning to change. Thursday morning dawned clear and cold, ice crystals decorating every surface like nature's lacework. Maggie waited behind the inn, her thin shawl inadequate against the January wind, but her spirit strangely warm. She'd been up since 4, completing her morning chores with unusual energy, earning suspicious glares from Mrs. Talbot, who couldn't find fault but clearly wanted to. The buckboard wagon rounded the corner precisely at noon, Carter handling the matched grays with easy competence. He pulled up beside her and set the brake, climbing down to help her into the wagon, a courtesy that made her chest tight with its unexpected normalcy. His hand was warm through her worn gloves, steady as he guided her up to the plank seat. Roads rough in places, he said by way of greeting. Snow melt and freeze has made ruts. Hold on when I tell you. She nodded, arranging her skirts, trying not to notice how different the world looked from up here. The wagon seat put her at eye level with the town's second-story windows, high enough to see over fences into private yards. A new perspective on familiar things. They rode in silence through town, past the mercantile where Mr. Henderson swept his porch, past the church where Reverend Coleman tended his small garden. Some folks stared. The auction girl riding with the widowed rancher was certainly gossip-worthy. But Carter seemed unbothered, touching his hat to those who greeted him, maintaining the same steady pace. Once beyond the town limits, the land opened up like a book spread wide. Maggie had seen it from the stagecoach window, but that was different. She'd been cargo then, being delivered. Now, seated beside Carter as something approaching an equal, the vast Wyoming territory struck her differently. The sky pressed down endless and blue, no buildings to break its dominance. Mountains rose in the distance, white-capped and severe. The prairie rolled in frozen waves of yellow grass, punctuated by dark patches of sage. "It's so empty," she said without thinking. Then worried she'd offended him. This was his chosen land. "Full. More like," he replied. "Just full of different things than people expect. See that hawk redtail? Probably watching a rabbit trail. Those tracks there, antelope heading to water. That bare patch might look dead, but come spring it'll be solid with wildflowers. Indian paintbrush and lupine." She looked where he pointed, beginning to see the land through his eyes. Not empty, but waiting. Not barren, but resting. The wagon jolted over a particularly deep rut, and she grabbed the seat's edge. "Told you it was rough. Should smooth out once we reach my property line." "How much is yours?" 6,000 acres, give or take. Started with 600. Built it up over time. Mary always said I was land hungry." His voice carried fondness rather than grief this time. She was probably right. They passed through a gate marked with 3 C's burned into the crossbeam. The road did smooth out here, maintained by his own effort. Split rail fences lined the path, and she could see cattle in the distance, dark shapes against the pale grass. Everything spoke of order, planning, careful management. The ranch house appeared as they crested a rise, not grand but solid, built to withstand Wyoming's tantrums. 2 stories of log and stone, windows facing all directions, a porch wrapping around 3 sides. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, promising warmth. Outbuildings clustered nearby barn, smokehouse, what looked like a bunkhouse for hands. "It's beautiful," Maggie said, meaning it. After months in the cramped inn, the space felt like luxury. "Mary designed most of it. I just provided labor." He pulled the wagon up to the side door. "Come on, I'll introduce you to Maria." The kitchen door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back severely but kind eyes that crinkled with her smile. She wore a flour-dusted apron over a practical black dress. "So, you're the girl from town Samuel won't stop not talking about," Maria said in accented English, her knowing look making Carter shift uncomfortably. "Maria, this is Miss Crawford. She's here to help with preserving." Preserving. Maria's tone suggested she knew exactly what kind of preserving was needed. "Come, mija. You're too thin. We fixed that." The kitchen was paradise warm, spacious, filled with the smell of bread baking. Copper pots hung from hooks, herbs dried in bunches from the rafters. The wood-burning stove dominated one wall, its heat reaching every corner. Windows looked out on a kitchen garden, dormant now but clearly well planned. "First, we eat," Maria declared. "Then we work." She served them thick slices of fresh bread with butter and honey, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and dried apple slices soaked in cinnamon. Maggie tried to eat delicately, but hunger won. Maria watched approvingly, pushing more food toward her. "Now," Carter said, finishing his coffee, "let me show you what needs doing." He led her outside to the garden, Maria following with a knowing smile. The plot was larger than the entire inn, laid out in neat rows marked with stakes. Most was winter bare, but root vegetables still inhabited the ground, their tops showing green against the frost. "Turnips, carrots, potatoes in the root cellar already," he explained. "But we've got preserves to make, pickles to put up." Maria's getting too old for all of it, though she won't admit it. "I hear everything. Samuel Carter," Maria called from the porch. He almost smiled. "See what I mean? Come, I'll show you the chickens." The hen house stood protected from wind by the barn, and when he opened the door, warm air and the sound of contented clucking emerged. 24 hens roosted or pecked at scattered corn, their red combs bright in the dim light. "Eggs every day," he said. "Sometimes twice if they're feeling generous. You'll gather them when you're here. Maria will show you how to handle the broody ones." He continued the tour: smokehouse with hams hanging, root cellar built into the hillside, spring house where butter and milk stayed cold. Everything efficient, well maintained. Speaking of years of careful work, "There's something else," he said finally. leading her down a path toward a stand of cottonwoods, something Mary particularly loved. The trees parted to reveal a creek, running clear despite the winter cold, ice forming at the edges, but the center still flowing. The sound of water over rocks filled the small grove, peaceful and constant. Spring-fed, he explained. Never freezes completely. Mary used to come here when she needed quiet, said it reminded her of home in Missouri. Maggie stood at the bank, looking at the water running free and endless. Something in her chest loosened, a tightness she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. Without thinking, she sat on a fallen log and began unlacing her boots. "What are you doing?" I just need... She couldn't explain the compulsion. Her boots came off, then her darned stockings. The ground was cold under her feet, but she stepped forward anyway, lifting her skirts carefully. The water was shockingly cold, cold enough to steal breath, but she stood in it anyway. The current pushed against her ankles, insistent and alive. She closed her eyes, remembering another creek, another life. Before papers and sales and ownership, when she was just Maggie, standing in water because she chose to. Tears came without warning, silent but abundant. Not sad tears, something else. Relief, maybe, or recognition. The water didn't care about her papers, her debt, her status. It simply flowed, as it always had, as it always would. When she opened her eyes, Carter stood on the bank, holding a handkerchief out to her. His face showed understanding rather than pity. Mary stood there too. "First time I brought her here," he said quietly. "Said water that cold made a person remember they were alive." She took the handkerchief, wiping her eyes, then stepped out of the creek. Her feet were numb, but she felt more awake than she had in months. He helped her back to the log, then surprised her by kneeling to dry her feet with his own handkerchief. Matter of fact, as if he did this daily. "Can't have you catching cold," he said practically. "Too much work to do." They walked back to the house in comfortable silence. Maria had set up the kitchen for preserving jars boiling for sterilization, pectin ready, sugar measured. She took one look at Maggie's red eyes and damp hem and wrapped her in a fierce hug. "Bueno," she said simply. "Now we work." They spent the afternoon making peach preserves from the ranch's dried fruit, Maria teaching with patience and humor. Carter disappeared to tend ranch business but returned periodically, sampling their work, offering quiet praise. As the sun began to sink, 12 jars of golden preserves lined the counter, sealed and cooling. "These 4 are yours," Maria announced, pushing jars toward Maggie. "Your labor, your preserves." "I couldn't." "You could and will," Carter interrupted. "That was the agreement. What you preserve, you keep part of simple economics." That phrase again. But Maggie was beginning to understand it meant more than money. It was his way of maintaining dignity on both sides, making their arrangement business rather than charity. The ride back to town was quiet, the wagon bed holding her precious jars wrapped in flour sacks. As they reached the inn, Carter helped her down, then handed her the preserves. "Next Thursday?" he asked. "Yes." "Good. We'll start on the pickles." Maria's particular about her pickles. She watched him drive away, then looked at the jars in her basket. Her own preserves, made with her own hands, earned through her own labor. Inside each jar, summer floated suspended in amber sweetness, proof that some things could be saved, preserved, kept whole despite time's passage. That night, she opened one jar and ate a spoonful directly, letting the sweetness coat her tongue. It tasted of freedom, of creek water and endless sky, of a future that might belong to her again. The remaining 3 jars she hid beneath her mattress with the silver dollar, building her treasury of hope, one small sweetness at a time. March arrived with a false spring, warm enough to melt the snow but not the frost in the ground. Maggie had settled into a rhythm Sunday baskets, Thursday preserving, and the endless labor at the in-between, Her small cash beneath the mattress had grown $7 silver now, 12 jars of various preserves, and a length of calico Maria had given her for when you make your own dress. She was wiping down tables after the lunch crowd when Marshall Hutchins entered, his face more uncomfortable than usual. Behind him stood a man she didn't recognize, thin, wearing a too-fine suit for Copper Creek, carrying a leather document case that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "Miss Crawford," the marshal began, then stopped, cleared his throat, tried again. "This here's Mr. Pemberton, from Boston. He's got papers." The thin man stepped forward, his smile sharp as winter ice. "Miss Margaret Crawford, formerly number 47 in the Boston Municipal Auction." Her hand stilled on the wash rag. "Yes. I represent the Thornfield Agency. There seems to be an irregularity with your account." He opened his case. Withdrawing papers bearing the official seal, she remembered the wax red as blood, impressed with the Commonwealth's mark. "You were contracted for domestic service, payment to be rendered through labor over a period of 7 years. However, you failed to remit the required monthly transportation fees." "Transportation fees?" Her voice came out steady, though her knees trembled. "I was told the sale price included everything." "A common misunderstanding." His smile widened. "The sale price covered your acquisition, transportation, housing verification, monthly status reports, all additional, compounding monthly. The amount now stands at E." He consulted his papers. $47.36. More than she'd managed to save in 3 months of scrimping. More than she could hope to save in a year. The room spun slightly, and she gripped the table's edge. Mrs. Talbot emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the voices. Her eyes lit with interest at the sight of official papers. "What's this about? The girl owes money." Pemberton explained smoothly. "Unless paid immediately, she's to be returned to Boston for resale. The new buyer would, naturally, assume the accumulated debt plus additional fees." Resale. Mrs. Talbot tested the word, and Maggie saw calculations flickering in her eyes. "And if someone here were to pay the debt, then ownership would transfer accordingly. The agency is quite flexible about these arrangements." They discussed her like livestock at market, weight and worth and cost per pound. Maggie stood frozen, watching her carefully built hope crumble. $7 hidden beneath a mattress against a debt designed to be unpayable. The game had been rigged from the start. "I'll need time to consider," Mrs. Talbot said finally. "The girl's useful, but $47 is substantial. Perhaps 30 would be more reasonable." "The amount is non-negotiable," Pemberton replied. "However, I'm authorized to accept payment plans, with interest, naturally." The bell above the door chimed. Samuel Carter entered, removing his hat, taking in the scene with those gray eyes that missed nothing. He noted Maggie's white knuckles on the table, Mrs. Talbot's predatory interest, the Boston man's calculating smile. "Afternoon," he said mildly. "Am I interrupting business? Nothing that concerns you, Mr. Carter?" Mrs. Talbot said quickly. "Simply a matter of the girl's papers." "The girl has a name," Carter said, still mild, but with something underneath that made Pemberton step back slightly. "And any business concerning my employees concerns me." "Your employee," Pemberton's voice sharpened. Carter reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded document. "Miss Crawford has been under contract to the Triple C Ranch since January. Agricultural work, food preservation, general household management. The terms are quite specific." He handed the paper to Pemberton, who read it with increasing frustration. "This is dated 2 months ago." "Indeed, filed with the Territorial Office, as required by law." Carter's tone remained conversational. "You'll note the clause regarding prior obligations. Under Wyoming Territory law, local employment contracts supersede Eastern debt collections for persons engaged in agricultural development. The Homestead Protection Act of 1871, I believe. That's not that can't be legal." Judge Morrison would disagree. He was quite clear when he ruled on the Hendricks case last year. Eastern contracts have no standing against territorial agricultural agreements. Something about promoting settlement and development. Carter pulled out another paper. I took the liberty of having him write an opinion when I filed Miss Crawford's employment papers. Pemberton read the judge's statement, his face reddening. This is irregular, highly irregular. Perhaps, but legal. Carter turned to Mrs. Talbot. Of course, this means Miss Crawford needs to relocate to the ranch immediately. Full-time agricultural work requires residence. I trust you'll have no objection, given the legal circumstances. Mrs. Talbot's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. But she owes me 2 weeks' notice, which I'm prepared to buy out. Carter placed coins on the table. That should cover any inconvenience. Pemberton made one last attempt. The agency will contest this. We have lawyers. As do I. Carter's smile held no warmth. Perhaps you've heard of Richardson and Associates in Cheyenne. They handle all CCC legal matters. Very thorough, very expensive. I imagine the agency might find the cost of pursuing $47 through territorial courts somewhat prohibitive. The Boston man's face cycled through several colors before settling on defeated gray. He closed his document case with sharp snaps. This isn't over. I believe it is. Carter stepped aside, clearing the path to the door. Marshal, would you escort Mr. Pemberton to the stage? I believe it leaves within the hour. After they left, Mrs. Talbot rounded on Carter. You've no right. I've every right to hire who I choose. His voice cut through her protest. Miss Crawford, collect your things. Maria's expecting you. Maggie stood frozen, unable to process the sudden reversal. I don't understand. Simple economics, he said, but his eyes were soft. Ranch needs a full-time hand. You need proper employment, mutually beneficial. You planned this. The accusation slipped out before she could stop it. Since January, he admitted. Took a while to get the paperwork right. Judge Morrison owed me a favor from when I helped his son out of some trouble. The law's real, though. Looked it up myself. Mrs. Talbot stomped back to the kitchen, slamming pots to express her displeasure. Alone with Carter. Maggie found her voice. Why? He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the street where Pemberton was being hastily escorted to the waiting stage. Mary was from Pennsylvania originally. Came west as a mail-order bride to a man who died before she arrived. Town was ready to auction her off to pay his debts. I married her instead. He turned back to Maggie. Spent 7 years convincing her she wasn't property. Best 7 years of my life. And you think? I don't think anything except you're a good worker and the ranch needs help. The rest is your business. He moved toward the door, then paused. Wagons outside. Take your time collecting your things, but best we're gone before that stage leaves. Pemberton might get ambitious. Maggie ran upstairs to her narrow room, pulling her few possessions from beneath the mattress. $7 silver, 12 jars of preserves, the calico cloth, the original silver dollar he'd given her that first night, her mother's thimble from the life before. Everything she owned fit in the same carpet bag she'd arrived with, except now it held hope instead of emptiness. She found Carter waiting by the wagon, studying the sky for weather signs. He helped her up to the seat, his hand steady and sure. As they pulled away from the inn, she saw Mrs. Talbot watching from the window, her expression sour as turned milk. I can't pay you back, Maggie said as they passed the town limits. Didn't ask you to. The law you cited, is it real? Real enough. Helped write it myself, matter of fact. Served 2 terms in the territorial legislature before Mary took sick. Figured laws should protect people trying to build something, not Eastern agencies trying to profit from desperation. They rode in silence for a while, the spring sun warm on her face. Finally, she asked. What did you mean? About Mary being a mail-order bride. Just what I said. She answered an advertisement. Came west to marry Tom Morrison, the judge's brother. Actually, Tom died of fever 2 days before she arrived. Town tried to sell her to recover his debts. I attended the auction. His hands tightened on the reins. Bought her freedom, then asked if she'd like to get married proper, or just work the ranch. Took her 3 years to choose marriage. Worth the wait. And you see me the same way. I see you as someone who deserves a chance to choose. He glanced at her sideways. Ranch needs help. You need work. Everything else is up to you. They pulled up to the ranch house as sunset painted the mountains gold. Maria stood on the porch, beaming like she'd won a prize at the county fair. About time, she called. I've got your room ready, mija? The blue room with morning sun? The blue room. Maggie remembered it from her tour, a corner room with 2 windows, a real bed with an iron frame, a dresser with a mirror, a room for a person, not a servant. That night, after supper where she sat at the table as an equal, after Maria helped her settle her few things in the blue room, after the house quieted with nightfall, Maggie sat on her new bed and counted her treasures. 7 silver dollars that were truly hers. 12 jars of preserves she'd made with her own hands. A length of calico for a dress she'd sew herself. And freedom not given but earned. Not granted but claimed through work and patience and the strange economics of a man who understood that dignity couldn't be bought, only recognized. She pressed the original silver dollar between her palms, remembering that first shared meal, understanding now that Carter had been planning her rescue from that moment. Not rescue, she corrected herself. Partnership. He needed help, she needed work. Simple economics that were anything but simple. Built on a foundation of territorial law and human decency. Mortared with preserves in Sunday baskets and conversations by the well. Outside her window, the creek sang its endless song of water over stone, free-flowing and unstoppable. Tomorrow she would stand in it again, not seeking freedom, but celebrating it. Her feet in water that belonged to no one and everyone, herself included. The blue room stood at the corner of the 2nd floor, catching both morning and afternoon light through windows that faced east and south. Carter pushed open the door, then stepped back, letting Maggie enter first, the gesture small, courteous. Treating her as a guest rather than hired help made her throat tight. Maria aired it out this week, he said from the doorway. Was Mary's sewing room, but that was years ago. Been empty since. The room wasn't large, but after months in a space barely wider than her shoulders, it felt palatial. An iron bedstead stood against one wall, its frame painted white and dressed with a patchwork quilt in shades of blue and cream. The dresser was simple pine, but someone had cared enough to carve wildflowers along its edges. A pitcher and basin sat on its top, white porcelain with tiny painted violets. A braided rug covered the floor beside the bed, its colors faded but pattern still clear. The window's open, Carter said, moving past her to demonstrate. Sometimes gets warm up here in summer. That mountain view helps on difficult days. Through the eastern window, the Rockies rose in layers of blue and purple, snow-capped peaks catching the last light. The southern window looked down on the kitchen garden and beyond to the creek's line of cottonwoods. Her eye caught movement, deer emerging from the tree line, cautious but unafraid. They come most evenings, Carter explained. Mary used to watch them from here while she sewed. Said they knew things people forgot about being careful but not fearful. Maggie set her carpetbag on the bed, the springs creaking slightly with disuse. Everything smelled of lavender and cedar. Sachets Maria must have placed to keep the mustiness at bay. On the small table beside the bed sat an oil lamp, its chimney painted with climbing roses. Delicate work that spoke of patient hands. That was Mary's favorite, Carter said quietly. Maria thought you should have it. Said empty rooms need light and life. I don't want to intrude. You're not. His voice carried certainty. Mary believed useful things should be used. Let them sit too long and they forget their purpose. Maria appeared in the doorway, arms full of linens. Men standing around talking while work needs doing. Typical. But her smile softened the words. Come, mija, help me make this bed proper. Samuel, go check your horses, or whatever men do when women need to talk. Carter left with what might have been relief. Maria spread the sheets with practiced efficiency, teaching Maggie her particular way of folding corners. Hospital corners, she explained. Learned from the sisters at the mission school. Stays neat no matter how restless you sleep. As they worked, Maria talked, her voice carrying the rhythm of someone sharing necessary history. Samuel brought Mary here as a bride, young both of them, full of plans. They built this house together, log by log. She wanted the windows just so light in every room, views of something green. Said houses without proper light grew small inside, made people small too. She smoothed the quilt, her weathered hands gentle on the fabric. This quilt, she made the year before she took sick. Every house needs color, she'd say. Otherwise, it's just shelter, not home. She was right. After she passed, Samuel tried sleeping up here, couldn't bear their room downstairs. But this room held too much of her happiness, so it sat empty, waiting. Waiting for what? For someone who needed it, I suppose. Maria moved to the dresser, opening drawers to reveal lavender sachets and clean paper lining. She got the consumption 2 winters ago. Fought it hard, but mountain winters are cruel to weak lungs. Samuel tried everything, brought doctors from Denver, sent for medicines from back east. But some things can't be fixed with money or determination. Maggie understood that helplessness, the way illness took choices away. How did he manage after? Badly, at first. Worked himself brutal. Sunrise to past midnight. The ranch prospered, but he got thinner, quieter. Started taking meals in town just to avoid the empty chair at his table. That's when I started worrying proper. Man can die of useful work if his heart's not in it. But he seems settled now. Maria gave her a knowing look. Past 3 months, yes. Since Christmas, specifically. Started eating regular meals again. Even heard him humming once, though he'd deny it fierce. She patted Maggie's hand. Empty rooms need filling, empty people too. Now come, supper's waiting. The kitchen felt different now that Maggie belonged here. Her place at the table to Carter's left. Maria's right had been set with the same blue willow plates as the others. No distinction between employer and employed. Just 3 people sharing a meal. Carter said grace, simple words thanking Providence for food and shelter and present company. They ate Maria's stew, rich with beef from ranch cattle and vegetables from the root cellar. Fresh bread, still warm. Butter churned that morning. Simple food made special by the ease around the table. No tension or careful distance. Tomorrow we'll start the spring planting, Carter said between bites. Garden needs turning. Seeds need starting. Maria usually manages it, but her knees complain more each year. My knees are fine, Maria protested. It's my back that argues. Your everything argues, Carter replied dryly. That's why we needed help. They continued this gentle bickering, and Maggie realized this was their way, the fondness beneath the complaints, the care disguised as practicality. When supper finished, Maria shooed them both to the porch. Digestion needs peace, not dishwater. Go sit, I'll manage. The porch stretched along the house's front, deep enough for chairs and thinking. Carter settled into a worn rocker, gestured for Maggie to take its match. The sunset had faded to purple, first stars emerging like promises. The temperature dropped quickly at this altitude, and Maggie pulled her shawl closer. Cold? No, just adjusting. The air's different here, thinner but somehow more substantial. That's a good way to put it. He rocked slowly, the rhythm hypnotic. Mary said similar when she first arrived. Said the air back east was thick with other people's lives. But here you could breathe your own breath. How did you really meet, not just the auction? He was quiet long enough she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I was 24, full of plans and empty pockets. Took me 3 years to save enough for the land purchase, another 2 to build anything worth living in. By then, town gossip had me pegged as hermit or worse. When Tom Morrison advertised for a mail-order bride, everyone laughed who'd marry into that family. But his letter to Mary must have had something real in it. Because she came. He paused, studying the emerging stars. I knew Tom wouldn't suit her the moment she stepped off the stage. Too refined for his rough ways, too much thinking behind her eyes for his simple wants. When he died, fever took him quick. The town saw opportunity. Debts to settle. Property to claim. The auction was set before his body was cold. That's cruel. That's frontier economics. Everything has value. Everything's for sale. His voice carried old anger, banked but not forgotten. I attended planning to buy Tom's horses, but when they brought Mary out, dressed in her traveling clothes, trying so hard to stand proud while they discussed her like livestock, I couldn't abide it. So you bought her. Bought her freedom? Important distinction. Took her straight to Judge Morrison, Tom's brother. Ironically, and had the papers drawn up proper. Employment contract with wages, room and board, clear terms. Then asked if she'd prefer the ranch or I could stake her for passage back east. She chose the ranch. Eventually. Took her a week to decide. Longest week of my life. Wondering if I'd done right or just traded one cage for another. When she said yes, she had conditions. Her own room. Wages in her own name. Freedom to leave with 2 weeks' notice. I agreed to everything. When did it change? From employment to marriage. Gradual, then sudden, like spring coming. You don't notice the daily changes. Then one morning everything's green. Took 3 years. 3 years of suppers and conversations and working side by side. 3 years of her teaching me to see beauty I'd been too busy to notice. 3 years of me teaching her the land wasn't something to fight, but to partner with. A coyote called in the distance, answered by another. The sound should have been eerie, but felt instead like punctuation, the land adding its voice to their conversation. The marriage proposal wasn't grand. We were putting up preserves, kitchen hot as blazes, both of us sticky with peach juice. I said, "Would be easier if we just made this official." She said, "That your idea of a proposal?" I said. "Yes," she said. Then yes. Got married that Sunday after church. Maggie smiled at the practicality of it. Simple economics. The simplest. 2 people choosing to build something together. He stood, stretching. We had 7 good years. 7 years of full rooms and full hearts. Then the sickness came, and I learned the hardest economics of all. Some debts can't be paid. Some losses can't be recovered. He moved toward the door, then paused. This place got too quiet after Mary passed. Not just absent of sound, but absent of purpose. Ranch work fills days but not evenings. Maria helps, but she goes to her own cabin at night. Quiet settles different when you've known fullness. Is that why you helped me to fill the quiet? He considered this. Maybe partially, but mostly because it was right. Mary would have skinned me alive if I'd let another woman go through what she faced. He opened the door, lamplight spilling onto the porch. Besides, preserves don't make themselves, and Maria's knees really do complain. Later, alone in the blue room, Maggie arranged her possessions on the dresser. In the center, her mother's silver thimble, all that remained of the woman who'd raised her with love before fever took her too. To its left, the brass auction tag, number 47, which she'd kept as reminder and warning. To its right, Carter's silver dollar from that first night, when kindness came disguised as commerce. 3 objects telling the story of who she'd been, who she'd become, who she might yet be. Past, present, and possibility lined up on pine wood someone had cared enough to carve with flowers. She changed into her nightgown, a proper one Maria had provided, soft cotton instead of rough linen, and slipped between sheets that smelled of sunshine and lavender. The bed was soft, the quilt warm, the pillow filled with goose down instead of straw. Through the window, stars continued their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. For the first time since the auction house, she felt safe. Not just physically protected, but emotionally sheltered, held by walls that had known love and loss and continued standing. The house creaked gently, settling for night. And somewhere below, she heard Carter's boots on the floorboards, his own preparations for sleep. Tomorrow would bring work, garden turning, seed planting, the endless cycle of ranch life. But tonight, in a room painted blue by a woman who believed in color and light. Maggie closed her eyes without fear. The creek sang in the distance, water over stone. That sound of continuance and possibility. She slept deep and dreamless, her breathing matching the house's rhythm. Two entities learning to exist together in earned peace. September arrived in a glory of gold, the aspens on the mountain slopes turning like coins in sunlight. A year had passed since Maggie's arrival at Copper Creek, a year that had transformed her from auction property to something she was still learning to name. She stood in the kitchen garden, her hands deep in soil, pulling the last of the carrots while sunrise painted the mountains rose and amber. The garden had become hers in all but deed. What had started as help for Maria had evolved into full responsibility, and the results spread before her in abundant proof of her labor. Corn stalks heavy with ears, their silk browning toward harvest. Tomatoes weighing down their stakes, red as rubies in morning light. Squash vines sprawling beyond their designated rows, rebellious in their prosperity. "You've got your mother's hands," Maria said from the porch, watching Maggie work. It was the highest compliment she gave, comparing someone to the sainted dead. Mary's, no, mija, your own mother's. Hands that know how to coax life from earth. It's in the blood, that knowing. Maggie straightened, brushing soil from her apron, a new one she'd sewn herself from the calico Maria had given her. In the past months, she'd made 3 dresses, 2 aprons, and a winter cloak, each stitch an act of ownership over her own life. "The corn's ready," she called to Carter, who was checking the fence line. "Should we start the harvest today?" He walked over, his gait easier than a year ago. The constant tension in his shoulders softened. "Your call. It's your garden." "It's the ranch's garden. That you planned, planted, tended, and will preserve. I'd say that makes it yours." This had become their gentle argument: ownership versus partnership, boundaries versus belonging. Maggie had learned to keep careful accounts, tracking every seed planted, every jar preserved, every dozen eggs gathered. Her ledger, purchased with her own saved wages, contained neat columns of contributions and calculations. She knew her worth now in tangible terms, bushels and pecks, dozens and pounds. They were discussing the corn harvest when dust rose on the road from town. A buggy approached, too fine for neighbors, too formal for friends. As it drew closer, Maggie recognized Mr. Whitman from the bank, his black suit inappropriate for ranch visits, his pale hands gripping the reins like they might bite. "Carter," he called, climbing down awkwardly. "Miss Crawford, good to see you both." Carter's expression went carefully neutral. "Whitman, what brings you out?" "Business. I'm afraid. Perhaps we could speak privately. Anything concerning the ranch can be discussed freely. Miss Crawford manages the books now." This was true. Maggie had taken over the ranch accounts 3 months ago when she'd caught an error in the feed store's billing. Her education, before her father's death and the debts that followed, had included arithmetic and bookkeeping. Whitman adjusted his spectacles nervously. "It's actually Miss Crawford I've come about. There's been a development with her situation." The morning went cold despite the sunshine. Maggie felt the familiar clench of dread, the feeling that freedom was always temporary, always conditional. "What development?" Carter's voice carried warning. "Good news, actually." Whitman pulled papers from his jacket. "The Thornfield Agency has declared bankruptcy. Apparently, Mr. Pemberton was embezzling funds, taking payments from auction contracts, but not forwarding them to Boston. The whole enterprise has collapsed. And all contracts are void. The federal court in Boston ruled last month. Anyone under auction papers is free and clear. No debts remaining. He turned to Maggie. You're completely free. Miss Crawford? No papers, no obligations, no ownership by anyone. Maggie's knees went weak. She sat hard on the garden bench, staring at the banker. Free. Completely. In fact, there's compensation available. The court ordered the agency's assets liquidated to pay damages to those affected. He produced a bank draft. $800, your portion of the settlement. $800. More money than she'd imagined possessing. Enough to go anywhere, start anything, become anyone. The draft trembled in her hands. Furthermore, Whitman continued, his manner becoming oily, I've been authorized to make you an additional offer. There's a gentleman in Denver, Mr. Harrison, who's looking for an experienced household manager. He's offering significant wages, $30 monthly plus accommodation. He asked me to approach you specifically, having heard of your work here. How did he hear of her work? Carter asked, his tone dangerous. Well, the Triple C's success this year hasn't gone unnoticed. The preserve orders from town, the garden production. It's clear Miss Crawford has exceptional skills. Whitman produced another paper. This is a contract for 1 year's employment, with a signing bonus of $200, $1,000 total, plus wages, more money than most women saw in a lifetime, enough to truly start over, maybe even buy a small house somewhere, have something that was entirely hers. The position starts immediately, Whitman added. Mr. Harrison has sent a private carriage. It's waiting in town. Maggie looked at the papers spread before her. Freedom, money, opportunity, everything she'd dreamed of in those dark months at the inn. She stood, walking to the garden's edge, looking at the corn ready for harvest. Her corn, her tomatoes, her careful rows of vegetables that would feed the ranch through winter. Behind her, she heard Carter tell Whitman to wait, that Miss Crawford needed time to consider. She heard the banker protest about the carriage waiting, the urgency of decision. She heard Maria emerge from the house, her Spanish muttering conveying opinion without translation. Maggie walked among the corn rows, running her hands along the stalks she'd planted from seed. At the garden's far end stood her pride, a small glass house Carter had helped her build for starting seedlings, paid for with her own savings. Inside, next rows of preserves waited, each jar labeled in her careful hand, M. Crawford, Triple C Ranch, 1881. Her name, her work, her place. She thought of Denver buildings and bustle, theaters and shops. She thought of being household manager to a wealthy man, respected for her skills, paid well for her service. She thought of freedom that came from money in the bank, choices fully her own. Then she thought of mornings in this garden, mist rising from the creek, deer stepping delicate between bean rows. She thought of evenings on the porch, Carter reading aloud from books while she mended, Maria adding commentary from her rocking chair. She thought of winter nights when they'd played cards by the fire, teaching each other different games from different childhoods. She thought of Carter's face when she'd served the first meal made entirely from garden produce. The pride in his eyes that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with recognition. The way he'd said, "You've made this place alive again." Maggie walked back to where the men waited. Whitman had spread more papers on the garden table, his fountain pen ready. The bank draft sat beside the Denver contract, 2 futures laid out neat as ledger columns. She picked up the bank draft, $800 of compensation for suffering, payment for being sold. She folded it carefully, placed it in her apron pocket, her money, her choice. Then she picked up the Denver contract, studying its formal language, its promises and terms. "This is a generous offer," she said to Whitman. Mr. Harrison is a generous man. You'd want for nothing. I'd want for everything, she corrected. She tore the contract in half, then quarters, then eighths, letting the pieces fall like snow. I'm not for sale. Not anymore. Not ever again, Whitman sputtered. But the opportunity, the money, I have a proposal instead, Maggie said, turning to Carter. A business proposition? Carter's expression was carefully blank, but she saw something kindle in his eyes. I'm listening. The Triple C needs expansion, more gardens, greenhouse cultivation, preserve production for the growing town. I propose a partnership. I invest my settlement money in ranch improvements, proper canning equipment, a larger greenhouse, maybe even fruit trees. In exchange, I want percentage ownership, 20% of profits from agricultural production. That's, Whitman started. Business, Carter interrupted. And for the first time since Mary's death, Maggie saw him truly smile, not the small, sad movements that passed for smiles, but something that transformed his whole face. That's good business. Fair terms. I accept. They shook hands there in the garden, formal as any contract signing. Whitman gathered his rejected papers, muttering about foolish decisions and missed opportunities. As his buggy departed, dust settling in its wake, the three of them stood among the ready harvest. 20% might have been low, Carter said. Could have asked for 30. 20's fair. Leaves room for negotiation on future ventures. Future ventures. I've been thinking about chickens, expanding the flock, selling eggs in town, maybe even shipping to Denver. They're paying premium for fresh eggs. Carter laughed. Actually laughed, the sound rusty but real. Mary always said the chickens were smarter than they looked, said they knew which people to trust. And they follow you everywhere. Haven't done that for anyone since her. That evening, they celebrated with apple butter making, all three of them in the kitchen, peeling and cooking and stirring, the house filled with cinnamon and sweetness, windows steaming with productive warmth. Maggie wore her new boots purchased with her own wages, leather soft and properly fitted. Her ledger lay open on the table, recording the apple harvest, calculating jar quantities, projecting winter sales. What will you do with the settlement money? Maria asked. Beyond the ranch improvements, Maggie considered. Save some. Maybe buy books, agricultural journals, seed catalogs, learn more about greenhouse cultivation. She paused. And I want to help other auction girls. Set up a fund. Maybe help them buy their freedom or start over. Mary would have liked that, Carter said quietly. She always said freedom shouldn't be lucky. It should be right. As they worked, Maggie felt the truth of her choice settling into her bones. She'd chosen not just freedom, but belonging. Not just independence, but interdependence. The partnership wasn't about ownership percentages or profit shares. It was about building something together, creating abundance where there'd been emptiness. Late that night, after the apple butter was jarred and cooling, Maggie stood in her blue room looking at her small collection of treasures. To the three objects on her dresser, she added a fourth, the torn pieces of the Denver contract, gathered and tied with string. A reminder that some offers, no matter how generous, cost more than money. Through her window, she could see Carter walking the fence line, checking gates before bed. He moved with purpose now, not the mechanical motion of survival, but the energy of someone with plans. Tomorrow they'd harvest corn together. Next week, they'd start planning the greenhouse expansion. Winter would come, but they'd meet it prepared. Preserved food in the cellar, seeds saved for spring, partnership papers filed proper with the territorial office. She was no longer auction property, no longer number 47, no longer defined by what she'd been sold for. She was Maggie Crawford, agricultural partner in the Triple C Ranch, maker of preserves that bore her name, tender of gardens that flourished under her hands. The brass auction tag still sat on her dresser, but now it was just metal, its power to define her finally, completely broken. December 24th arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. A year had passed since Maggie first stood outside the Riverside Inn, hungry and alone. Now she rode beside Carter on the wagon seat, her green velvet dress hidden beneath her warm cloak, both garments sewn by her own hands from fabric purchased with her own earnings. The trip to town wasn't for survival this time, it was for celebration. "List?" Carter asked, his breath clouding in the cold air. Maggie produced the paper from her pocket, reviewing their Christmas shopping needs. Coffee, sugar, flour, the usual staples. Maria wants cinnamon sticks and nutmeg for her special cookies. The Hendersons ordered 24 jars of apple butter for their family gathering. Mrs. Coleman wants preserved peaches for the church social tonight. And he glanced at her sideways, a small smile playing at his mouth. "And I may have promised the Murray children peppermint sticks if they helped with the egg gathering last week." Softening already. Mary always said the ranch would make a pushover of anyone with sense. The mention of Mary came easier now, woven into conversation like thread through fabric present, but not painful. They'd found a way to honor the past while building the future, keeping Mary's memory as blessing rather than burden. Copper Creek appeared around the bend, smoke rising from chimneys, the street busy with Christmas Eve preparations. But the town looked different to Maggie now. Where once she'd seen judgment and hierarchy, she now saw neighbors and customers. The transformation hadn't been sudden, it had taken months of fair dealing, quality preserves, and quiet dignity, but respect had finally replaced curiosity. They stopped first at Henderson's Mercantile, where Robert Henderson himself came to greet them. "Miss Crawford Carter, been hoping you'd come today. Those preserves you brought last week sold within hours. The Denver folks visiting for Christmas went wild for them." "We brought more," Maggie said, helping Carter unload the carefully packed jars. Apple butter, pickled beets, and the last of the peach preserves. Henderson examined each jar with the attention of a jeweler studying gems. Each bore Maggie's neat label, M. Crawford, Triple C Ranch, Premium Preserves. The labels had been Carter's idea, printed proper in Denver, a declaration of quality and ownership both. "I'll take everything you've got," Henderson declared. "And I've had inquiries about spring orders. The hotel in Denver wants a regular shipment." They conducted business there in the store, Maggie handling negotiations with confidence born from a year of practice. She knew her worth now not in auction papers or debt calculations, but in genuine value created by her own labor. When Henderson paid, he counted the money into her hand, not Carter's. Recognizing her as the agricultural partner she'd become, the other errands went similarly. At the feed store, Thomas asked her advice about starting his own garden. At the church, Reverend Coleman's wife thanked her for the donation of preserves to the winter charity drive. Even Marshall Hutchins, awkward as always, managed to mumble appreciation for the jar of pickles she'd left at his office. "One more stop," Carter said as they finished loading supplies. "The inn, tradition should be honored." The Riverside Inn looked exactly as it had a year ago, windows glowing amber, laughter spilling onto the street. But when they entered, Maggie walked straight and tall, Carter's equal rather than his charity. Mrs. Talbot, serving tables with her usual efficiency, went rigid at their arrival. "We'll take the corner table," Carter said mildly. "That's reserved for us, every Christmas Eve from now on." His tone brooked no argument. They sat at the same table where he'd first shared his meal, the same blue willow plates, the same ladder-back chairs, but everything else had changed. When the new serving girl another auction purchase, Maggie recognized the haunted eyes approached nervously. Maggie smiled encouragement. "The beef stew, please," she ordered. 2 bowls, and coffee." The girl's eyes widened at being addressed directly, kindly. "Yes, ma'am, right away." Ma'am. The title sat strangely but not unwelcome. Maggie had become someone who warranted respect, who could order her own meal and pay for it herself. When the food arrived, steaming and rich, Carter pushed the bread plate toward the center of the table. "Should we, for memory's sake?" He produced his pocket knife, the same bone-handled blade, and cut the bread precisely in half. But this time, they each took their portion freely. No charity or desperation involved. They ate as equals, discussing ranch business and spring plans, their conversation drawing curious glances from other diners. "The new greenhouse design looks promising," Carter said between bites. "That agricultural journal you ordered had good ideas about heating systems. Coal would be most efficient, but expensive initially. Though if the Denver contracts come through, we'd recover costs within 2 seasons. Your calculations usually prove right. I trust your judgment." Trust. Such a simple word for such a complex achievement. They'd built it through seasons of work, through preserved summers and planned springs, through careful negotiations that respected both parties' contributions. When they finished eating, Carter paid, they alternated now. A partnership in all things. As they prepared to leave, Maggie caught the serving girl's eye and pressed coins into her hand. "For the extra service. And this." She added $1, speaking quietly. "Save what you can. Freedom comes expensive, but pays dividends." The girl's eyes filled with tears she couldn't shed while working. Maggie understood that too, the necessity of maintaining composure while hope kindled inside. They left the inn as snow began to fall, large flakes that seemed to muffle sound and soften edges. The church social was starting, organ music drifting on the air, but Carter turned the wagon toward home instead. "Not staying for the social?" Maggie asked. "There's something else first, if you're willing." The ranch lay peaceful under its blanket of new snow. Carter stopped the wagon at the house, helping her down, then surprising her by taking her hand. "Walk with me." They followed the familiar path to the creek, their footsteps muffled by snow. The cottonwoods stood bare but beautiful, their branches creating lace patterns against the darkening sky. The creek ran as always, black water against white banks, too strong to freeze completely. At the same fallen log where she'd first removed her boots and stood in the water, Carter stopped. The last light was fading, but stars emerged to replace it, brilliant in the clear mountain air. "A year ago, you stood in this water," he began, his voice careful. "I watched you reclaim something, not just freedom, but yourself. It was like watching spring come in December. You gave me that chance. No, you took it. I just recognized it." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands. "This year has taught me something I thought I'd forgotten. That emptiness isn't permanent. That silence can be filled again. That 2 broken things might make something whole." He released her hands, reaching into his coat pocket. The small box he produced was worn velvet, aged but cared for. Inside, a cameo ring nestled in faded satin, the carved profile delicate as frost. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "Brought from Ireland before I was born. Mary wore it for 7 years, and it brought us joy. Now I'm asking not as employer, not as rescuer, but as a man who's learned to hope. Again, would you consider making this partnership permanent?" Maggie looked at the ring, at his face open with vulnerability, at the creek that sang its endless song of movement and possibility. "I'm not asking you to save me," he continued quickly, "but maybe we could save each other from the quiet, build something neither of us could manage alone. Simple economics of the heart." "Samuel Carter," she said, using his full name for the first time. "Are you proposing marriage or a business merger?" "Both. Either. Whatever you'll accept." She thought of the year behind them. Sunday baskets becoming Thursday wages, becoming partnership papers. She thought of careful distance becoming comfortable proximity, becoming something neither had named but both had felt. She thought of Mary's blue room becoming her room, of the ranch's gardens becoming her gardens, of his grief and her fear slowly transforming into their shared hope. "Yes," she said simply, "to both, to all of it." His hands shook slightly as he placed the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting. Then he did something unexpected. He knelt by the creek, cupping water in his hands and letting it run through his fingers. Mary used to say, water blessed everything it touched, made it clean and new. He stood, water still dripping from his hands. Seems right to mark this here, where you first chose freedom. Maggie knelt beside him, placing her own hands in the icy water. The cold shocked through her, but she held them there, feeling the current push against her palms. When she stood, Carter wrapped his hands around hers, warming them between his palms. When meet? She asked. Spring, when the garden's planted and everything's growing, seems appropriate. They walked back to the house hand in hand, snow still falling soft as blessing. Maria stood on the porch, lantern raised, and one look at their faces told her everything. About time, she declared, pulling them both into fierce embraces. I'll make coffee. We have plans to discuss. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, as they had so many evenings, but now planning a wedding rather than preserving schedules. Maria insisted on a proper celebration. Carter argued for simplicity, and Maggie mediated with practical suggestions that satisfied both. The announcement, Maria said suddenly. It must be in the paper. Let the whole territory know. Carter smiled. How's this? The Triple C Ranch announces the engagement of Miss Margaret Crawford, agricultural partner, to Mr. Samuel Carter, ranch owner. A spring wedding is planned, after which the operation will be known as Carter and Carter Ranch, full partnership in all endeavors. Perfect, Maggie said, though her throat was tight with emotion. Later, after Maria had retired to her cabin with tears of joy and elaborate plans, Maggie and Carter sat alone at the table. 2 plates remained from their late supper, crumbs of Maria's celebration cake scattered between them. The scene echoed that first Christmas Eve, 2 people sharing a meal but transformed entirely. No regrets? Carter asked. You could have gone to Denver, been a fine lady with servants and society. I'd rather be a partner with dirt under my nails and preserves bearing my name. She twisted the cameo ring, watching it catch the lamplight. Besides, fine ladies don't know the satisfaction of perfect apple butter or the peace of creek water on tired feet. Mary would have loved you, he said quietly. She always said the ranch was waiting for something. I thought she meant cattle or crops, but maybe she meant you. Maybe she meant us, Maggie corrected. The possibility of us. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. But inside, the kitchen was warm with more than stove heat. It was warm with promise, with partnership that had transcended its original economics to become something richer. When they finally parted for the night, still in separate rooms, propriety maintained until spring, Maggie stood in her blue room looking at her treasures. The auction tag had been joined by the partnership papers, the silver dollar accompanied by the bank draft representing her settlement. Her mother's thimble now sat beside Mary's cameo ring, past and present reconciled, creating a future neither obligation nor accident but choice. Through her window, she could see Carter checking the stock, his nightly ritual unchanged except for the set of his shoulders no longer bent with grief but straight with purpose. When he looked up at her window, she waved, and he touched his hat in that familiar gesture that had marked their careful courtship. Tomorrow was Christmas, and they'd celebrate with Maria, the 3 of them around the table that had seen so many transformations. There would be preserves to deliver, accounts to settle, spring plans to refine. But tonight, on this Christmas Eve that had come full circle from hunger to abundance, from isolation to belonging, Maggie Crawford, soon to be Carter, stood in her earned freedom and knew herself finally, fully, home. The creek sang its endless song. The snow fell soft as forgiveness. And in the kitchen below, 2 plates sat side by side, waiting for tomorrow's shared meal. You know, friend, I've told you this story because I believe we all carry auction tags inside us, invisible numbers that mark what we think we're worth. Maybe yours came from failure, from loss, from someone who should have loved you better. Mine came from watching my grandfather share his lunch with a stranger at a train depot. then learning years later that stranger became his business partner and closest friend. The truth is, family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the person who pushes a plate across when you're starving, not just for food, but for recognition that you're human. Sometimes it's the quiet presence that lets you stand in creek water and remember who you were before the world numbered you. Sometimes it's three people around a kitchen table, building something from preserved jars and patient seasons. Samuel Carter understood what we forget, that the simplest economics are these: everyone needs witness to their worth. Everyone needs a place at someone's table. Gratitude isn't just saying thanks, it's becoming someone who pushes plates across tables to other hungry souls. That's all any of us can do, really. Share what we have, make room, choose each other, over and over, until choosing becomes belonging, and belonging becomes home.